Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thanks so much for being here. I'm really just delighted this morning and feel very fortunate that we've been able to bring Dr. Jeff Danter here today. Jeff is the Senior Vice President and Atlantic Seaboard Division Director from the Trust for Public Land, or TPL. I should mention that my own experiences with TPL go back to Atlanta in the late 1990s when TPL was doing an incredible undertaking in preserving a long stretch of land along the Chattahoochee River. And all the way back in 1994, the Chattahoochee had been named one of America's most endangered urban rivers, a particular issue since that river basin provided about 70% of the drinking water to Metro Atlanta and was also a significant source for water, electricity, agriculture, and industry. With strong community involvement, TPL and its partners were able to raise about $160 million and preserve roughly 150 miles of riverfront land, not only improving the water quality, but also creating a mosaic of green space for public use and enjoyment. There are, as you probably know, a number of nonprofit conservation groups out there, each with its own unique mission. TPL's unique mission is land for people. What this really means is that people in the communities with whom TPL works define what they want from a conservation standpoint, and then TPL helps them achieve that vision through a plan developed jointly with the community called a green print, and as importantly, conservation finance measures, meaning how do you pay for it. So we asked Jeff to come here today and tell us how that works and to share with us some examples from the regions where TPL has community initiatives underway. We also see a good fit here with our region's Climate, Environment, and Readiness, or CLEAR plan. By the way, CLEAR now has a Facebook page, so please take a moment to check it out, give us some comments and feedback. And finally, a word on today's lineup. We're going to hear next from Dale Hendon from the Fredericksburg Regional Chamber of Commerce, and then from Dr. Richard Finkelstein, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at UMW, who will formally introduce Jeff. Jeff's presentation will take about 45 minutes, and after that, you're encouraged to ask questions. Please be participative. We'd like this to be as engaged as possible. So let me turn this over to Dale.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning, and good morning. We really appreciate you having the Fredericksburg Regional Chamber here as we continue these great and highly important discussions on what our community is going to look like over the next few years and looking into greening our future and what that's going to mean for the business community here. But first, I'd really like to take a moment to recognize the folks at Marcel, Day, and Rebecca for doing great work and being leaders in the community on these efforts. It's so important for us to be here today. At the Chambers, we're proud partners in this effort. We are able to do that through community efforts like the Green Business Initiatives Action Committee, which we seat at the Chamber. And in many ways, we recognize that it's a business imperative for us to take steps to promote our green spaces and also promote smart growth within the region. And it's a business imperative for those two reasons. The first is simple. As businesses, we must work to maintain the natural beauty of our region. These are places where families who work at and support our businesses go to relax, enjoy nature, learn about our planet, and hopefully spend lots of money in the region so we can continue to grow and expand. Our region is growing, and it will continue to grow, and it's our obligation to ensure that we do that very wisely. It's about embracing progress and sustaining assets. The second reason is because it makes business sense. In our offices, we can lower costs through efficiency and managing waste while sustaining and making small steps to make a big impact. Further, we can use green space as an economic benefit and resource for the community. With the effort, we will not only be able to improve the quality of life for citizens, but offer better services to support our businesses. We look forward to hearing from the Trust for Public Land on how we can do that, how their programs are geared toward making these strides in these initiatives, and coming to the table to be a partner in that. Thank you for having us today, and thank you for being here as well.
As Dean, excuse me, as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at University of Mary Washington, I'm just delighted to welcome everybody here today. It's wonderful to see such a large turnout, as it has been wonderful to see large turnouts for our various CLEAR meetings in the last year or two. I'm delighted to say that, like many institutions of higher education, the University of Mary Washington is strongly committed to doing the right thing for the environment. The president has formed a sustainability council that's been doing important things for the last couple of years to green the campus, as well as to engage students with projects in the community. In part, thanks to Rebecca Rubin's inspiration, over the last 1 to 2 years, we've been working to develop the CLEAR plan, the Climate and Environmental Action Plan, that, as Rebecca reminded us, now has a Facebook page on which some directions, some links were recently posted late last night, so I encourage you all to look at them. We're delighted with CLEAR, actually, to have raised some money and to be continuing to raise money to provide internships and experiential learning opportunities for our students who are strongly committed to making not just Fredericksburg, but all of Planning District 16 a model for planning, for prevention, and for sustainability. In fact, just this summer, or at the latest this fall, we're looking forward to students beginning work on an inventory of emissions in the city of Fredericksburg itself. Really, what's been going on at University of Mary Washington is an extension of tremendous work that has really always been going on in different ways in the Fredericksburg community. As many of you have seen in the Freelance Star, or have been reminded by the articles that recently appeared in the Freelance Star, in historic preservation, in working to preserve the Rappahannock River, in working to preserve large green spaces, thanks to the Battlefield Trust, in other ways, in preservation that the Garden Club of Virginia has been doing. There's really a long tradition in Fredericksburg and in general in our region of giving attention to what we really now think of as green or environmental issues. And I would just like to mention some of the organizations that have been really involved in that for many, many years, and who have worked together collaboratively and who will be continuing, thanks I think in part to the CLEAR project, to be moving forward in a collaborative way to build sustainability in the region. It's really a very long list, and it's extraordinary how much energy there has been in this area for a long time that people often don't think about. I'm thinking not just about some that I've mentioned, like the Garden Club of Virginia, but the Friends of the Rappahannock, the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. At the Community Foundation, there's been a long-term fund, the Duff McDuff Fund, which supports green initiatives, the National Academy of Environmental Design, Rappahannock Goodwill, which is a leader in recycling, the soil and water conservation districts in the counties, of course, Tree Fredericksburg, which was recently awarded an important honor by the city for having planted thousands of trees in the last several years. The George Washington Regional Commission, of course, has been involved. And I'm very glad to say that the Fredericksburg Chamber of Commerce has been a very, very strong supporter of environmental efforts because, as we just heard, they recognize that sustainability and green industry and preserving the environment are really crucial factors in making for a strong business environment. Of course, all this couldn't happen without the help of communications, and we're continually grateful to the Freelance Star newspaper for supporting this effort by giving us editorial space and reporting on the efforts of CLEAR and the other good work that's been done. So thanks to all of you, many of whom are here today. It's my honor and privilege, though, to introduce Jeff Danter. In his role as Senior Vice President, in his role as Senior Vice President of the Trust for Public Lands, he's responsible for the field programs of the Trust in the states from South Carolina to Maine. These programs demonstrate the breadth of TPL's Land for People mission, as they include projects from the remote mountains of western Maine to the most urban neighborhoods of New York and Philadelphia. Before joining the Trust for Public Land in November 2011, Jeff worked 13 years for the Nature Conservancy, serving as the Florida State Director, Alabama State Director, and Director of the Disney Wilderness Preserve. Jeff also served as an instructor for the Bureau of Land Management and for The Ohio State University. In fact, he received his PhD in ecological management communications from Ohio State. He co-authored a textbook, Environmental Communications, Theory and Applications for Natural Resource Managers, Engineers, and Scientists. Earlier, he received his Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering and his Master's in Business Administration from The Ohio State University. Jeff has also worked in corporate finance for 10 years at the electrical engineering firm ASSIA Brown Boveri. Jeff works for the Trust for Public Land office in Washington. He lives with his wife and son in Bethesda, Maryland. I might add that he fought traffic, or will be fighting traffic, to return home probably. So we're especially grateful for his being with us today. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Danter to speak to us.
So I will start by getting rid of the disturbing giant face. It's nothing quite as scary as that. Where do I point this here? Good, there we go. Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank Fredericksburg and the university here for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here. I want to thank Rebecca Rubin for the invitation, Dean Finkelstein, Mr. Hendon. This is really, I think, a great opportunity to talk to a community that's beginning to work on something that I think is really at the right time as I survey what I see going on in communities across the country. I worry a little bit. No, here we go. Which way are we going? There we go. I worry a little bit that what I'm going to say today is going to sound like I'm coming to shill for the Trust for Public Land, and that's not really my intention at all. What I'm hoping to do today is present some ideas and approaches that the Trust for Public Land uses in organizing around things like this CLEAR program that you all are kicking off here in the Fredericksburg area. So I hope to be able at the end of this presentation to sort of push everything back and say, okay, how can this be a catalyst to your thinking about how to move forward. This is an outline in case it gets kind of strange about where I'm going. I'm going to start off giving you a little bit of background about the Trust for Public Land, although Rebecca already did a great job of that. And I specifically want to talk about this process that we call green printing and how we engage the community with that. We also have a program that's related called Climate Smart Cities that I think is particularly appropriate to some of the things you all are thinking about. And then I'll give 3 examples of how the Trust for Public Land has used that approach in places around the country. And then I'll finish up with really talking about conservation finance, which is one mechanism that you might consider for how to pay for this kind of thing. All right. So the Trust for Public Land, as Rebecca said, is a national conservation organization. We've been around for 41 years, and our particular brand of conservation, our flavor of organization, is in those 2 words, for people. For us, conservation serves the people in any given community. And what that means, or the implications for us as an organization, are kind of profound. We generally are not the group that comes in and sets the priorities for conservation in any one place. What we endeavor to do is draw those priorities out of the community, the values of that community, the visions of that community, and then try to express those values through the public land in that community. As I say, we've been around for 41 years, and in 41 years, we've completed more than 5,000 projects across the country. Projects like land protection, parks development, and that kind of thing. Let's see, I'm trying to remember, what's the number? More than 10 million people live within a 10-minute walk of a Trust for Public Land project. And we do it through 5 broad strategies. And starting at the top here, we have something that we call conservation vision and GIS. I won't talk too much about that because I'm going to talk about it a lot here for a few minutes. Conservation finance. Conservation finance is really how do communities pay for local conservation, basically through taxing themselves. And I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. Perhaps we're best known as an organization through our conservation transaction work, buying land on behalf of the public. And this is something that we've done across the country. We've done it here in Virginia. Last year we opened something at Virginia Beach, or did a project at Virginia Beach Pleasure House Point. And as I say, we've done it across the country. It's something that we're particularly good at. We particularly like big, hairy, audacious projects that are complicated. We have, though, created 340 land trusts, local land trusts, to be our partners in local communities, because a lot of times we don't need to be there. Another organization, a more local organization, would be better at that particular strategy. And if that local organization doesn't exist, we then go in and create the organization, empower it, send it on its way to be our partner in the local community. We do an enormous amount of park design and development. Every place from Billings, Montana to inner city New York, we're going into communities and activating parks, because just creating a public space doesn't mean that it's really working for the community. So increasingly we find that we can bring the same tools that we use to from land protection to this development process in order to create a park that really serves the needs of the community. And finally, research and education. We're sort of the leader in how people use space. Just in my office in DC, we have a group called the Center for City Parks Excellence that tracks the way parks are funded, developed, and used across the country in order to be able to provide services to local communities on how other people might be doing things, funding things, and so forth. So now I really want to drill down on this idea of conservation vision and GIS. The idea here, GIS is simply a tool, Geographic Information Systems, a tool to, in its most basic sense, create maps that can be used for decision making. I'm lucky enough to be talking about something that I have some understanding of in front of two faculty members from here who know a lot about it, so I'm not nervous about that at all. But this GIS approach has come to underpin everything the Trust for Public Land does. We would not dream of undertaking any kind of project, large or small, without really basing it in a spatially explicit set of data. In the end, for us to serve our mission, we need to be able to link back to real data, not just sort of good feelings about what we do, and ultimately to be able to measure the impact that we're having against the goals that we've developed with the community. So here's two example maps that I just sort of didn't pull at random on how the conservation community, and in this case the Trust for Public Land, thinks or might use GIS in decision making. These are two maps that come from our work with the Department of Defense, the REPI program, which is really, its base sense about, base sense, I didn't mean it that way, but about buffering the mission of military installations across the country. The one on the left is from the Hood Canal. It's a submarine base on the west coast. They're very concerned about development along the waterway and how that might negatively impact the operation of that base. There are national forests around it and lots of conservation opportunities from sort of the bird and bunny and tree conservation work, and really finding ways to layer conservation outcomes with base buffering outcomes in a way that's really financially, economically efficient and works for that community. On the right is a map that you may have seen, and if you haven't seen, it's at least really familiar to you. This is the same kind of idea about base buffering around Fort A.P. Hill and Dahlgren, and really how those interact with the Rappahannock National Wildlife Refuge. It's a map that in this particular map is identifying land parcels more than 200 acres that might be appropriate for National Wildlife Refuge or REPI acquisition in order to buffer the base and at the same time meet these sort of biological needs. But this is simply demonstrating a tool. Many organizations have the ability to develop maps like this. It's almost become just sort of the standard way that we think about conservation. I noted that even, here in Fredericksburg, there's the city actually has a portal to a GIS system that people can get into and look at GIS maps for the city of Fredericksburg. And this is rolling out, and as I say, is an important trend in conservation, but in and of itself doesn't sort of define the way the Trust for Public Land works. What I really want to do is go one step further and talk about this idea of green printing. This is an out-of-date map showing where we've done green prints across the country. Green printing is really the process that we use to pull those community values out, identify them, and work with communities to plan conservation. And in this case, GIS becomes the tool by which we facilitate a conversation in the community. Green printing is a process. The process is far more important than the green print, which is the product. Here's kind of a basic four-step version of what the green printing process looks like. Constituency building is really about making sure that we have the right people at the table in order to really draw out those community values and community priorities. And this is not as simple as it seems. One of the things I learned in my work with the Bureau of Land Management is that when you go into a community, the voices who are loudest are not necessarily indicative of the way the community feels. And so there is a community organizing almost aspect of this, of making sure that you really are in contact with how the community feels about things. And that goes everywhere from the leadership level in the community down to church groups or recreation groups or whatever, to make sure people get to the table and you're able to draw out all the values that are in that community. And then in the second step, this GIS is really used as a tool to facilitate a conversation. And I'll show how that works in a minute. And then conservation finance is sort of a pathway to say, okay, here's this great vision that you have, but obviously it's going to take money to do that. We can bring in a team to help you figure out how to pay for it. Or on the other side of that coin, figure out how much you might be able to generate to pay for some part of that vision at any point in time. And then the final one is action planning, because it's not about planning, it's actually about expressing these values on the ground. And so we use a process that would be familiar, to demonstrate some early wins, leverage off that into bigger wins until you fully express the vision in that community. Charlotte, North Carolina, where I'm currently doing some work, is a great example of this. When we did a comprehensive green print, really showed what the community wanted out of the park system in Mecklenburg County. They used that green print to create a bond initiative and created a lot of capital funds to acquire and develop parks in Mecklenburg County. Once they had the money secured from a 10-year bond initiative, then they created a parks plan that was based on the green print, showing exactly what they wanted to do with those funds. Then they're in the process right now of going out and acquiring new parks and developing existing parks, and even beginning to look at how to optimize various parks for things like recreation and health. So that they know that they're getting the best bang for their buck according to what they originally said they wanted to do. So all of these things can work together almost seamlessly over time to express that community vision. I want to give an example from Maine. This is the lake region of Maine. It's characterized by lakes. But also a lot of small towns and villages. This isn't Portland or Bangor, Maine. This is a part of Maine that is rural, but quickly becoming not rural. And we were brought in to do this green printing and sort of bring a lot of communities together and create a common vision for the landscape in Maine. And when we first approached the leadership, they gave us these 7 priorities that they were looking to protect. This is what they told us they wanted to achieve through this process. Some of them are obvious: protect water resources, we know what that looks like, or preserve plant and animal habitat. Preserve working farms and forests, for them, was about they didn't want to lose the basis for their economy. And so this was really an economic argument. Not that there weren't other economic drivers that they could bring in, but they liked this economic approach. Protect scenic views, kind of obvious. The one I really wanted to highlight was protect and enhance existing trails. Understand that in Maine, a very important part of the culture is snowmobiling. And there is a network of snowmobile trails all over the state that are loved and well used. And there is a concern that as communities develop, a community could be cut off from that network of trails. So when you think about it, building a shopping center or a new housing development could eliminate a trailhead, eliminate access to a snowmobiling trail. Yeah, at the same time, creating a really tightly restricted nature preserve could also cut off access to a snowmobile trail. And so they were very concerned that as they thought about expressing changes in the landscape, that they would always have access to this enormous network of trails, and that became a big priority for them. Maintaining the small town character, providing recreation, fairly standard stuff that we see across the country. Each one of these values can be mapped. And so that's the first step in the green printing process, is to go out and either find the existing data or create new data sets in order to be able to express those values in a map that you can take to the table with the community and say, okay, so you want to talk about water resources, here are your water resources, this is what a buffer around that water resource might look like, and so forth. And then here are the 7 maps, you can map all of these things. And in the way GIS works, you can layer all those maps on top of each other and come up with sort of a consolidated map that expresses all those values at once. And this at one point was sort of the great sophistication, is to be able to say, well, if we overlap one data set with another data set and we look for where those things coexist, that would be a really efficient place to do protection work, because you're meeting more than one goal with one strategy. But that actually doesn't really express the community values. So the approach that we developed was an interactive approach to say, okay, we've got all these maps, we can express these different values, but the conversation we really ought to have is, which of those values is more important to you? How would we trade off access to those snowmobile trails with protecting farm and timber resources, or whatever it might be? And so we've got an interactive GIS process where we actually hold community meetings and bring people in, and we talk about these explicit trade-offs. The idea being that eventually we're going to create a map that's weighted along what the community wants. In this case, and this is a little contrived, the community said that water quality was 30% important, trail connections 10%, park equity 10%, and wildlife protection 50%. And so we can use those weightings to create a final map, and from that begin to look at action planning on what they really want to accomplish. Now that weighting can be done either as a whole community sort of thing, and we have those little electronic clickers so people can sit in a meeting and vote, and that vote can immediately be expressed as a new map. Or it can even be done at the very top level by the mayor or the city council or whomever, who can set those priorities themselves. As an example, we're doing some fitness, trying to optimize parks in Mecklenburg County and Charlotte for fitness, and actually putting outdoor fitness equipment in parks. And we ran a complete analysis to show which parks would best help public health in Charlotte. But ultimately, it was made up of giant data sets, and we asked the Parks Department to go through and say, well, which ones do you think are more important? And they were able to provide that weighting. We were able to then provide them a prioritized list of parks to express this particular set of developments in. So the outcome is a map, but it's really more than a map. Increasingly, we're being asked to actually create an online portal that people can get into and actually manipulate the data themselves and create customized maps. So yeah, here's sort of the community map, but perhaps if you work for a wildlife group, even though the community developed one map, your interest might actually just be on the wildlife resources. We did work in northern Maine where protecting the forest products industry is really important, and a lot of people are concerned about high productivity forest soils. And so there's a group of people who are really focused on that and how forest products get to mills. So they're really focused on those maps. So this data can be made available to the entire community or to some subset of the community so that people can make their own maps and drive their own local decision making and along those things that particularly interest them. And this can be password protected at any level. So perhaps you only want to give a few people access to this. Maybe you want to give everybody access to this. Maybe you want some data sets to be only accessible by a few people and other data sets to be accessible by everybody. And all that can be sort of structured around this data portal. Are we doing on time? Okay. So I want to transition from this idea of green printing and expressing local values to climate resilient or climate smart cities. And the reason we went to climate smart cities is because increasingly what the Trust for Public Land has heard in city after city after city is we think we have a problem with climate resilience and that's one of the values we need to express. And that's not simple. That's a pretty complicated set of things. And so we've developed an entire program now to be able to work in cities, pilot different strategies to really work with communities in this space. You know, and the reason is pretty clear. The storms, the heat waves, sea level rise, drought, all these things are impacting communities across the country. And what's really become shockingly clear is they're impacting our most vulnerable communities. And I don't mean most vulnerable to climate change issues. What I mean is they're disproportionately impacting the poor, the elderly, those people with health problems. They're the ones who are really struggling with these climate-related impacts. And we as the Trust for Public Land sort of feel that very deeply because we want public lands and public land strategies to really benefit everybody. You know, what's also interesting to me about this slide is Katrina, Ike, Irene, Sandy is sort of a map of my career as I've moved around the country in conservation. These things are following me. So, the Trust for Public Lands approach to climate resilience in communities really has 4 big parts. We call them cool, protect, absorb, and connect. I rearranged these because this is more poetic than any other arrangement. But these are the 4 things that we really think through when we start working in a community about climate resilience. And I will briefly describe them. I'm going to start with cool. And I'm late to thinking this is important, so there's nothing more powerful than a conversion experience. The urban heat island effect is increasingly important, and we're seeing sort of the impacts play out on the news, and sometimes we don't quite string together that this is happening over and over again. In 2011, there was a dramatic heat wave in Chicago, and they had nearly 500 people die from it. So this is a serious issue. It basically boils down to this. In cities, large and small, daytime temperatures can be up to 5 degrees warmer than normal because of the heat island effect, because cities, hardscape, are absorbing heat. But at night, temperatures can be up to 22 degrees warmer than, say, a rural situation. And disproportionately, that is impacting, again, the most vulnerable parts of the community, the elderly, the poor, and people with health problems. The map that you see on the left is the District of Columbia. The green areas are treed. The blue or purple or whatever color that is are areas without trees. And the areas without trees are where all the heat accumulates. This could easily be a map of income for the District of Columbia. So the wealthy parts of the District of Columbia have tons of trees. The not wealthy parts of the District of Columbia don't have any trees. And the consequences are that the heat is a lot higher in those parts of the community that are poorer. I'm going to give an example of this in a real place in a minute, but moving on to the next one, protect. So Public lands can play a great role in protecting communities from, say, storm surge. I'm going to talk a lot about Hurricane Sandy in a few minutes, but these are two pictures from Staten Island. The big picture, kind of on the right, is Old Place Creek on Staten Island. This is a property that was purchased on behalf of the city by the Trust for Public Land, and then the wetlands were restored. Now, you all saw the pictures of the devastation in New York City from Hurricane Sandy, and it was horrific, and it was particularly horrific on Staten Island. But just beyond these trees that you see at the top are a hotel and several major businesses. Because of these wetlands that were between the storm surge and those businesses, there was almost no damage to those businesses. Billions of dollars of damage from storm surge in New York City, but not on the other side of these wetlands. What you see in the little inset is a park that was, again, acquired and developed by the Trust for Public Land. And nobody's going to argue that that park is some kind of natural system, that's a natural ecosystem like the wetlands on the right. But it's a park that was designed for storm surge. Everything in the park is designed to be flooded. So if there's a major flood, there will be no damage to that. But furthermore, it's designed with a series of swales and hills to absorb the energy of storm surge, thus protecting the properties on the other side of it. So if we can identify the right technologies, the right approaches to lands like these, and we can put them in the right places, then we can protect those communities and businesses near shores in order to protect them from future storms like Sandy. Absorb. The picture here is of a typical New York City playground. It's a giant asphalt lot. There is a little playground facility off to the right, but as you go across New York City, you find that kids are being asked to play, if they're allowed outside at all, in a giant asphalt lot. A lot of times they're not asked to play on those because the teachers park there and it's just used as a parking lot. Now the problem that New York City has is twofold. The first problem is what I call the 1-inch rain problem, which is if there's an inch of rain in New York City, a 1-inch rain event, they have a combined sewer overflow system, and what that means is that the stormwater washes into basically what's the septic system, and all the raw sewage gets washed out into the Hudson River. And as a consequence, it's not someplace you'd want to really swim or be a part of. And so they're actually under an EPA consent order to clean up water quality coming from this combined sewer system. The other problem is that Hurricane Irene caused massive flooding, not from storm surge, but from rain. And the system was totally unable to handle that amount of rain in such a short period of time. And so they had massive damage from just too much rainwater on the ground. So if you look at something like this, this is a giant impervious surface, so any water that falls on this blacktop playground just washes right into the storm sewer and exacerbates all of these problems that we've been talking about. So the Trust for Public Lands approach is to create a new playground, which is actually almost a park next to the school. And this playground was designed with kids because everything we do, we work with the community. The community here is children, and we bring a landscape architect in, and we spend 9 weeks in the classroom with kids, getting them to express what they want from their play space, and also teaching them about water pollution and water conservation and how this playground might help solve water problems. And the thing to understand is everything you see in this playground is underlaid by several feet of gravel. This playground is designed to absorb the first inch of any rainfall on site. Absorbs it, doesn't release it, filters down through the soil, never hits the sewer system. And we're doing this in cities across the country: New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, LA, San Francisco, Cleveland, soon Milwaukee, as a way to get multiple benefits from one place. And I'll also say this, working with the city and the school district and the Department of Environmental Protection, Not only is this a green playground, but it now serves as a community park. Because what the schools would do is they'd lock their facilities, half an hour after classes end. As part of the deal we have to develop these, they are now designed to be open all the time. So in the evenings, the weekends, over the summer, this playground now serves as a community park. We've done about 140 of these in New York City and dramatically changed the citizens of New York's access to parks by creating parks where there were just lots. Finally, connect. The fourth strategy for sort of our climate smart cities is to build essentially sort of multimodal trails that allow people to bicycle, walk, run, skateboard, whatever, as an alternative means for getting around. And there are several benefits to this. One is simply health and recreation. And there are statistics that show decreases in healthcare costs over time for people who bicycle to work as opposed to drive to work and so forth. And it also just gives transportation alternatives in communities where traffic is a real problem. And I noted you all have a trail here in town on the river. That's fantastic. I have found that any place where the community has invested in something like that, among all the other benefits, is just an increase in sort of quality of life. It's just a tremendous asset to have. I have one that runs right in front of my house in Bethesda. The dogs love it. They bark all day long. So let me give you some examples of where the Trust for Public Land has implemented these strategies and how they work. And I'll start, I've referred to New York City several times. We've been working in New York City for a long, long time. It's a very complicated map, and I don't really want you to try to dive into the details. What this map shows is, to begin with, that we have completed several green prints over time in New York City. And they're at the crosshatch area you can see up in Jamaica Bay on your far right. That we did a big green print up there. We've done several green prints along the west side on the far left of Staten Island. All of those dots that you see out there are either land acquisition, park development, playground development projects, hundreds of them that we've completed over time in New York City. The things with the little boxes are just some current work that we've done, and if you could read it, you'd say, that's interesting. What's blue, the dark blue that you see, is the extent of Hurricane Sandy's storm surge. So what's happened here is that we were doing all this work and we were talking about things like storm buffering, and then we got a real world example. And that really sort of allows us to do many things. What we've done just recently is we've created a program with the harbor estuary there to accomplish several things. We've raised almost $1 million. We've got money from NOAA, significant foundations, and other things to really dive into this. And the first piece of it is to say, well, we'd already put this green infrastructure in place, these absorbing playgrounds and all that. How did it work? How much, were properties really protected? Did we really absorb water? So we've partnered with Columbia University and CC Run. CC Run's a big collaborative of universities, and here it's code for Drexel. So we're working with Drexel and Columbia to really evaluate how did this stuff work, and economically did it benefit the community. And then, working with the same groups and New York City, and now just recently the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, we're looking at not only taking what we've learned about past green infrastructure performance, but can we use what we learned there to map where the new places ought to be? Where are the places that we really need to do this kind of work, restore wetlands, create buffer parks, that kind of thing, to have the best benefit to that community? And can we demonstrate that? Let's get on the ground, do that work so that the next storm that comes along will be able to show whether this is an effective strategy or not. And being that it's 2014, the whole thing has to be portable to an iPhone or an iPad so that people can go out in the field, pull these maps up, pull all the data up, look at the place on the ground, and really ground truth whether that's working or not, as well as add data into the data sets from being there. So that's an approach in a super huge city, as is this one. I don't want to give the impression that the only thing we care about is parks. So this is in Los Angeles, and it's what's called the Green Alleys program. These are alleys, exactly what you think of as alleys. They lie between every street in some neighborhoods. And so the idea was to optimize the alleys for cool, connect, and absorb strategies of our resilient cities process. And so the cool part is we put street trees in alleys and where the alleys intersect the streets to try to cool down this local heating effect. Connect, can these alleys be optimized for alternative transportation so that people can use them for bicycling, walking, that kind of thing? And absorb, can we absorb stormwater in these alleys? So we have done some pilot tests in alleys in the Avalon neighborhood of Los Angeles. We've brought in Arizona State University and UCLA to actually research the cost effectiveness of this. And once we have those data on the cost effectiveness, we can start to come up with a plan to optimize that and demonstrate it in other places to see if this is a strategy that's really going to work for Los Angeles. And right now it looks really good. This is something that doesn't take up any extra space, but really changes the nature of this neighborhood in Los Angeles. I want to talk finally about Chattanooga, a community that I would actually encourage you to look at because I think it has some of the same things you do. At least, on the face of it, it's a modest-sized southern town on a big river dominated by battlefield sites. So it sounds familiar. We came in there and we really wanted to talk about or what they wanted us to talk about was how to make a resilient Chattanooga, develop a resilience plan for the city. They were really interested in health. How do we make parks work for public health? About how do we connect parks because they really want a walkable, bikeable city. They really wanted us to look at climate, and they really wanted us to, they have terrible combined sewer problems and really wanted to look at green infrastructure as a way to do better water management. And this is still underway. I don't have a lot of results to show you, but I did want to show you some of the initial maps. This is a map of heat islands in the city, so we can map heat effects. And as you can see, there are parts of the city where there are dramatic problems with heat absorption and nighttime high nighttime temperatures. And this is a big part of their plan is figuring out a way to address that. What's perhaps more interesting are these two maps. They also are both of heat islands. The one on the right is tree canopy and heat islands, which isn't particularly interesting. I think we would all have guessed that fewer trees means more heat. But it basically shows where there aren't trees in the city. The one on the left shows heat islands and impervious cover, which again says, well, we would expect that you didn't have trees where you have concrete. But what it suggests is a strategy to manage stormwater with pervious parks that also have trees. So you get a double benefit. You get this water management, water quality impact at the same time that you're abating heat island effect. And then that allows the city planners to start to envision parks and other kinds of public spaces that are going to meet several goals. The map on the left is accessibility to parks. We have a process that I haven't talked about called Park Score, but basically how many parks can you walk to? The areas in here that are red are places that really need new parks. The places that are orange also need, but maybe the need's not quite so high, new parks. The map on the right is a map of health data, things like diabetes and heart disease, childhood diabetes, to really start to talk about where can we optimize parks for health benefits? What things can you put in the parks that are going to allow people to live healthier lifestyles, get more exercise, and that kind of thing? So so the city of Chattanooga is now looking at how do we jam all these things together to be cooler, better water management, healthier, and those kinds of things. And these maps are eventually going to lead to that decision-making process. So the big question that ought to be on your minds is, well, that's all great. How as you go through this process, do you pay for it? And one means, as I stated earlier, to pay for these things is to really start to look at ballot initiatives for people to, in one form or another, tax themselves to pay for these public benefits. We maintain a database called Land Vote. of ballot initiatives across the country. These are not necessarily ones that we've been involved in. The green ones are the ones that have passed, and the white ones are the ones that didn't pass. But the experience here is that a dramatic number of communities choose to invest public dollars in their park system or their open space or whatever. We have a department which, even before I worked for the Trust for Public Land, I felt was the platinum standard in doing this kind of work. You can kind of see, these are ballot measures that the Trust for Public Land has been involved with beginning in 1996, and you can see we have a fairly high rate of passing. And really, other than 2009, which is really a reaction to the economic meltdown, communities consistently choose to do this kind of thing if there's a compelling vision for what they want to accomplish. And so since 1996, we've helped create almost $35 billion of state and local funding for public lands in states down to communities and special ballot districts. Part of the key to this is really having a good process. I just briefly want to touch on the process. Feasibility research. This is the kind of thing, part of the reason that there's a high success rate is that we really need to understand what's going on in a community. Not every community is ready or has the ability or lots of reasons to enter into this kind of thing. A lot of times there are competing needs for money. We run up against low-income housing or transportation kinds of ballot initiatives. And so there's a timing aspect, and as I say, whether or not there's a compelling vision in the community for what they want to do with their public land. So sometimes, we'll go into a feasibility project and just say, our advice to you is don't do this now. We do a lot of public opinion surveys to figure out, again, how people are thinking about their public space, what is really going to be needed to generate the kind of voter support that's required for these. We make recommendations to a city council or a mayor or county commission or whatever on how to move forward with this. We'll even write ballot language if that's required, create a campaign strategy, go out and fundraise. We can do all of those stuff leading up to election day when these things either pass or fail. And as I say, with ours, a large proportion of them pass. And then afterwards, what's not on here, I wish there was, is then we'll continue to work with the community on how this is enacted. Do you have the systems in place to actually be able to manage these funds and accomplish the things that you wanted to accomplish? Again, this is a piece that's sometimes added onto the community visioning, green printing process. Sometimes it's not. It's not predetermined that this is where a community is going to go, and there are other alternatives for funding these things, depending on what that vision looks like. All right, so we're wrapping up. So in preparation for coming today and in talking to Rebecca, the real reason I think that I'm here is this CLEAR program, the Climate, Environment, and Readiness program that's been outlined and now has a new Facebook page. And what I really wanted to look at were the goals here. So these are the goals. This comes right off the website. And when I look at these goals, and I reflect back on the Trust for Public Lands experiences in communities across the country, these look really familiar to me. This is what a lot of communities are struggling with. This is what a lot of communities want to do. And finding out how public lands, whether they be park systems or any other kind of public land approach, and those investments in public lands can really serve all of these goals. And the key is to drive from sort of this high-level goal down to really digging into the community and expressing those very detailed values, those very detailed hopes and aspirations in a community through these. That's the next step. And so what I've done today is not say, wow, look, here's the Trust for Public Land, this is the only way to do it, but to say to you, there are means, there are systems to get from this level of goals to an action plan that can be implemented on the ground and actually begin to reinforce this community, change this community, express this community vision in a really meaningful way. So that's my presentation. That's my reflection on sort of a nationwide experience and how it might relate to what's going on here in Fredericksburg. And I would love to take questions at this point. So thank you.
research. Who has initiated conversation with you?
So the question is, in communities, who's initiated the conversation? And the answer to that question is almost anybody. The Chattanooga example that I showed you, for example, there are two foundations that look like they're not technically community foundations, but they look like community foundations, really wanted us to come in and do this work. We actually had an office in Chattanooga already, and so it was the foundation community that reached out to us. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, a place that we're just beginning this work, the mayor reached out to us. So it can be local groups, it can be city government, it can be almost anybody who says, we think the time is right for us to have this discussion, and can you come in and talk about it a little bit?
Okay, in the back.
Jeff, question for you. How do you start the conversation with city officials in terms of showing them the cost effectiveness of, say, converting the asphalt and permeable surface type of playground to something with green infrastructure? And are there metrics for that? Are there ways to help show them in the long run that is all the benefits of it?
That is a great question, and I'm going to take a half pass on that, only because it's an extremely complex question. Anytime you're dealing with stormwater and water quality issues, and particularly when the EPA has come in and created some kind of consent decree or something with a community to achieve certain things, it's a very technical, engineering-centric sort of discussion that you have. And it's gotten so complicated for us that just recently we've created a new position to do only that activity, to talk to mayors and water departments and that kind of thing about this. Now, I will tell you that different cities are in totally different places on this issue. So the city of Philadelphia, for example, is, I think, light years ahead of everybody else in the country in their thinking about this. They've totally changed the way they assess sewer fees to be based on how much impervious surface you have. They've set up a great system of incentives as well as financial penalties for stormwater, and then they funnel that money into really great projects like these playgrounds. Other cities are completely overwhelmed by what they're going to be required to do with their stormwater systems. And other cities take a very, very gray infrastructure engineering approach. So it's a really complicated discussion. But the one thing that's clear to us is more work needs to be done on monetizing these values and really being able to demonstrate the economic efficiency of one approach versus another. And that's complicated by sort of what we call the stacked benefits approach, where perhaps green infrastructure at a playground doesn't really save a lot of money on the versus gray infrastructure, but you get these other things. You get a school playground for kids to play on. You get a community gathering place or whatever. And so all of those things have to be monetized, and that's why we work a lot with universities trying to bring this together.
Well, Jeff, I think you maybe been largely answering the question I was going to ask, which is really early on in your presentation, you talked about gathering data and so forth, the crucial importance of that in building a method like this. And so maybe just as an add-on to what you just said, I was wondering if you could address the data that people find most persuasive. Because again, some of these things are so hard to quantify. So as you said, is it usage, like numbers of children who play on the playgrounds, or numbers of people who use a park or something like that, or does it go far beyond that?
Well, I don't want to oversimplify, but perhaps the number one thing that people in communities care about is jobs. And increasingly, we are trying to relate parks to jobs. Because this is a critical factor facing just town and city after town and city. And we do have something special to say there, but it's an area we're still learning in. When I first started with the Trust for Public Land, I was at a big national conference of all of our board members and staff and all that, and it was in Minneapolis. And the mayor of Minneapolis, who's a great advocate of parks, and Minneapolis is ranked #1 in the country for their park system, said to us, at the end of the day, the stuff that you guys do is great, but it's not the most important thing to any community in the country. what you have to do is demonstrate how what you do addresses the most critical concerns in any community, regardless of what those concerns are. Increasingly, things like health are really important. And we're doing a lot of work now with the CDC to generate spatially explicit data on a block-by-block basis in order to help communities think about parks as an intervention in health issues. And I got to tell you, I'm a big landscape biodiversity guy. That's where I've spent my community and done my research and all that. This is a totally new area for me, but it's really compelling. And so for a lot of communities, that's the thing. That's the thing that's keeping people awake at night. For other people, it's sprawl, and they want to envision a community that looks different than just block after block of strip malls and generic housing developments, say. And so that's what's keeping them awake at night. But in each of these cases, we can have something to say in the natural resource or conservation community to help bring something unique to that discussion. Does that answer? Okay.
I have two questions. I guess one, our planning district 16 here has two counties that are enjoying, if you will, explosive growth.
Right.
And the other two counties and the city are rich history and cultural environment. Do you have an example across the country of another situation like that?
Yes, I would point to two southern cities that I've referred to and I'm very, very fond of, frankly. One would be Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte is an old southern city that is now, from people who grew up there, a totally different city than it once was. And as a friend of mine who's a banker from Chicago living there said, this city's overrun with northern bankers. And it is a dramatically different city. It's two cities layered on top of each other. It really, truly is. And that, I think, creates a lot of social stress in the city. And they're looking for ways to express their culture in any way they can. And the other one is Chattanooga, which is I think, just one of the remarkable success stories, because this is an old industrial city where the industry went away, and it was really down on its luck. Through really creative visioning, they've been able to create a totally different feel and vibe, if you will, to that city in a lot of ways. And now they're with sort of the historic parts of the city and what I would call the funky parts of downtown and all that. Now suddenly everybody wants to live in Chattanooga, and it's being the development on the outskirts of Chattanooga is just rapidly increasing, and it's becoming. They've kind of lost control of it, and so you've kind of got two dynamics going on in the same city. So it's both a good thing and a bad thing that's happening. But it's not unusual depending on how you define the area. The planning district 16 is, it's big, right? It really is. So it's not unusual in a space that big to have multiple things going on.
Second question was, you mentioned the value, and I totally agree, of gathering data. And what you're talking about in GIS is a vast amount of data, much of which may not even exist at this point.
Right.
Infrastructure, is that something that your planning would be called for a multilateral effort between the partnership here today with University of Mary Washington, Marcel Day, and other cooperators? Or is this something that the TPL can bring the infrastructure in totally by itself and handle?
Yes, would be the answer to that. Yeah, we've done it both ways. There are some communities. This is. Rebecca's firm's really incredible, and I recognize that the city's already begun to do some interesting things, and then having the university here is really a powerful thing. not every university has a GIS shop, right? And this one does, so that's really important. And so as an organization, we would not come in and say, well, we don't need any of that stuff, or here's the way we do it. We work in collaboration when we can. Some places in Western Maine, you know, that infrastructure doesn't already exist, and so we pretty much go it alone. So it depends. But to the extent possible, it's really, really important to be part of the community, not coming in sort of dictating to the community. Even in a process that's designed to work with people, you know, if you're the infrastructure and you're ignoring what everybody else can bring to the table, then you're not truly working with the community. So yeah, that's something that we do all the time.
You mentioned sprawl a moment ago, and I couldn't help but think during the presentation that a lot of, I might have this wrong, you can correct me, a lot of what you're addressing are symptoms of sprawl. The lost land, additional asphalt, the health concerns. So basically you're trying to fight the symptoms of sprawl. It strikes me that it would be a whole lot cheaper, we get a lot more bang for the buck if we just stop the sprawl. The nice thing about that being, if we switched over to transit-oriented cities instead of automobile-oriented cities, it doesn't cost anything. What you're suggesting costs money. Switching over to a transit-oriented transportation system and ending sprawl, that saves us money. So who's attacking the sprawl instead of attacking the symptoms?
It's a really profound question. You know, one person's sprawl is another person's economic development program. And so how various communities think about these things differs from place to place. But increasingly, we're actually looking to hire people with city planning backgrounds because of this very issue, because we know how to do certain things, but the more we go down this road of the kinds of things I presented here, the more we're running into that very question or that very issue in you know, 100 different flavors of that question. And one, we partner a lot increasingly with planning departments and those kinds of things, but increasingly we're also finding the need to have some of that knowledge base on staff, because you know, we know a lot about transportation when it comes to implementing a trail system and how to you know, trade off bikes versus walkers, or how to, you know, put a trail system in a way that's safe and usable and accessible. When it comes down to understanding whether or not that's going to connect up with a light rail system, you know, I'm not really sure the Trust for Public Land is the organization you ought to be taking advice on. But that question comes up more and more often, right? And so it is a fundamental challenge to communities in the 21st century how to think about that. You know, I didn't use the Z word in my presentation, but a lot of the data sets that we create and maps that we create can be used in zoning, which is really, you know, one of the primary tools communities have to think about sprawl. So if you can envision, if you think about the way comprehensive plans were done, 20 years ago, when a lot of communities started doing comprehensive planning, the data-driven tools we have today are so much more sophisticated that, you know, the next generation of comprehensive plans that communities do are going to be much more powerful than the first set, and that's another way for communities to get a handle on sprawl. But I will say, I mean, most communities are really combating sprawl. Are really combating sprawl. But I tend not to want to paint with a generic brush here, because Bridgeport, Connecticut would love to have a little sprawl right now, because they've got empty lots and they need to do something with them.
You mentioned early on that a lot of times the loudest voices aren't particularly indicative of what the community wants. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the strategies used to recalibrate that conversation to make sure that the actual values are getting uncovered and it's not just the loudest people.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So, the question was, I made sort of a passing comment early on in my presentation that the loudest voices are not necessarily the voices that are reflective of the whole community. And I learned this in some of my work out west really early on in my career. I'd like to give as an example a project we're working on in Queens, New York, we're working on a 3.5-mile trail. This is going to be staggering. This is going to blow your mind, blows my mind. I don't know quite what to do with what I'm about to say. It's a 3.5-mile abandoned railroad that runs right through Queens, in a part of Queens that's economically depressed and park poor. And we are working with some local community groups to transform that into a linear, 3.5-mile long linear park. Our estimated cost to do that is $100 million. And that's something that you only do in New York City. And I was up there. It runs through Queens, where they're just within a half mile of that linear piece of property. It's already owned by the city, are over 100 defined ethnic groups. Okay, this is the most diverse community I have ever worked in. And there's a joke, and I learned this, there's a joke that New Yorkers tell, which is, how many New Yorkers does it take to change a light bulb? Well, it takes one to screw in the light bulb and 8.5 million to tell you why it's wrong and why it sucks. And that's been our experience. That's been our experience so far. And it's incumbent upon us to reach out to all 100 of those ethnic groups, to reach out to the schools that lie along that trail, to church groups, to civic organizations, in order to pull out what they really would like. Well, one, do they really want to do this? And what do they want to see expressed on that? And what's coming together is a vision that's really staggering, that this trail, this linear park, will not just be transportation. It'll not just be someplace that people go to play. The things that are being designed about it is to make it a real gathering space for the community. But we will actually express the ethnic diversity of Queens on this trail through food, art, dance, so on and so forth. And bringing all this information in has been incredibly gratifying and incredibly interesting. But we spend an enormous part of our time seeking out those groups, because the voices that'll tell you that it'll never work, they're really loud. Mm-hmm. But when you dig into the community, you'll find there's a real hunger for this, and that people really want to find it. So a lot of times, we will hire people from the local community to actually as staff, because this is a full-time thing to get out there and meet people. Or at other times we'll use, extension services or consulting groups or whatever. But it's really important to bring as many voices to the table as possible, because sure enough, when you leave out a major voice or even a minor voice from these decisions, and that person doesn't feel, or that group doesn't feel like their point of view has been heard, you've just created a bow wave in front of you that's really hard to overcome.
On a project like that, from the start when they bring you in and say, we'd like your help, what timeline would you expect to actually say it's been realized?
I was going to say that the Queens way, I've been asking my staff that very question. Okay, guys, how long is this going to take? And just so you know, a big project like that, we're working with Mayor Emanuel in Chicago on something called the 606, which is a 2.5-mile long rail-to-trail conversion through Chicago. And then I think it's about $90 million. And I only point that out because the one in my division is bigger. It's really important that we track these things. But the 606 is about a 10-year project. I look at say what's been going on in Chattanooga. In Charlotte, we did our first green print in, I want to say something like 2004. And just now we're getting to the point where they are aggressively buying land for their park system. And bear in mind, they had an economic meltdown in the middle of that time, so that may not be indicative. But to do the planning right and everything, just getting the green print right, it's going to take a year, 18 months, something like that. And that's to get to a point where you can start using it for decision making. It's a living, these data sets are living, and you're going to be constantly updating them all the time. But, you plan on a year and a half, 2 years to get to the point where you might start thinking about how you're going to execute on the ground for something of modest size, say. Just my personality is I always want to go faster and hit harder, and so I'm always challenging my organization on how to work faster. But some things you just can't push them any faster.
My question relates to the community engagement that you were just speaking to. And first of all, I think it's very impressive how well you've been able to integrate so many different areas of the community into the process for planning.
Thank you.
My question relates to kind of the later in the process, when you're actually building and implementing, as well as when it gets to maintenance. Do you have examples of how the community has taken any responsibility or ownership or gotten involved in those parts?
That is a great question. So, this isn't free. Having a great parks department or a great park system, or however you express these things, it does cost money to maintain. But one of the things we've learned is that local advocacy on behalf of a park or a park system or something like that is the critical piece of it. And so in those cases where there might be, let's just take as an example, a friends group, the Friends of XYZ Park, we try to engage them early on in the process and empower them to be the long-term stewards of that. Even when there's a parks department that is institutionally responsible for the upkeep of a park, that friends group in the neighborhood is really critical. But oftentimes those things don't exist. So in Newark, New Jersey, where we've done a lot of work in some really, really hard-hit neighborhoods, we've gone in and actually created park advocacy groups around specific parks. And then when we fundraise, and we could talk for hours on what our financial model is, but when we fundraise for our work in these things, we oftentimes create a stewardship fund. It keeps us engaged long after the ribbon's cut. And what we'll do is we'll maintain a fund for Jesse Allen Park in Newark, say. And the Friends of Jesse Allen Park will come to us every year with a list of stewardship, maintenance kinds of things that projects they want to engage in over the year. And they'll say, well, this is, we need $2,000, which doesn't seem like an enormous amount of money, but when you're the Friends of Jesse Allen Park, it's a staggering amount of money. And then we have the ability to say, write that check for $2,000 and say, okay, fine, go do that project. It keeps us paying attention to what's going on, maintains a relationship, allows us to steward that group. And those kinds of funds can be given directly to the government entity that's responsible for the park. It can go to a community foundation who plays that role of working with the advocacy group or whatever. But it's just really important that the people in a community rally around that public investment and make it their own. And just one story about that. We're doing work in Philadelphia at a Philadelphia Parks and Rec Department rec center. We went in and started working there at the request of the Parks and Rec Department. And when we said, oh, by the way, we found this one that's really prime, man, this thing's ready to go, we really want to work here, they went through their records and realized that they didn't know they owned it and they'd never been there. And as it turns out, this devastatingly poor Latino community had taken sort of ownership for this little park. They were the ones who painted the basketball courts. They were the ones who bought new nets and passed out balls. There's a handball court there. They had created a handball league and held tournaments every year. They maintained the facility totally by themselves. So when we went in to start working there, they already had look, this is what we need to make this park really sing. And it was fantastic. It's also intensely gratifying because we know that whatever we do there, it's going to be well maintained. Now that the city realizes they own it, they're going to be able to provide resources to that as well. But we know for certain that there are always eyes on that park making it do what it's supposed to do.
Doing communications, outreach, engagement with these communities, have you experienced any difficulties in socializing emerging trends in climate change and increasing natural disasters and things that might be polarizing to certain communities? Do you have strategies with which you roll out some of these plans for climate change, or how your parks can help with those things?
Every day, we run into those things. What I do from my presentations, like the one you just saw, is I sort of scrub out most of the science of climate change, because I don't want that to be the focus of my remarks or the discussion that I want to have. But the answer to the question is yes. Despite how I might feel about it, it can be controversial in communities. But at the same time, I think there's general recognition almost everywhere that the climate is changing, or at the very least, what local weather is changing. And the argument tends to be around the causes, and I would argue it's not even around the causes, but the implied interventions. I think that if you scratch any debate on climate change, what you find is people are thinking ahead 3 steps and saying, yeah, but if that's true, then that means we have to do X, and I don't want to do X, or we shouldn't do X. And so most of the work that we do, we've chosen to go down a different path on what we call climate resilience as opposed to climate change, which is in every community we work in, there's a recognition that the local weather is changing, whether that's Hurricane Sandy or drought or heat waves or storm events, whatever, and that it's costing the local community a lot of money, and they want to do something about it. They want to be better prepared for that, and that's a conversation that we can have, and just sort of set that other stuff off to the side. Like any organization, we're an advocacy organization. We advocate for the stuff that we do, but our climate change work is all about how do we generate more money to help communities be resilient. And I think that's just helpful from our point of view. I used to work for the Nature Conservancy, and they were going after the carbon thing really hard. So it's just a difference in the way the organizations work.
Jeff, I wanted to just ask you about the local land trust you mentioned earlier. You said, did I hear you correctly, that TPL has actually helped establish local land trusts to manage some of the property that you have conserved?
That's correct. 340 at last count. And so, for example, the Trust for Public Land does not purposefully own conservation land. I say purposefully because deals go bad and you get stuck holding something that you didn't want to own. I've got a golf course outside Boston if anybody's interested. The economics of golf courses have run away from us. But because of that, we don't hold conservation easements. We don't, we tend not to want to do that. And a lot of times there's the need for a local land trust to do those things, to hold easements, to hold land, even to engage in transactions, raise local money, do the stewardship, all of that kind of thing. And we're just not really set up as a national organization to do that, even when we have an office in town. So we established land trusts. And as I say, we've established 340 of them, and they're everything from land trusts working in rural areas to hold ranch easements to highly urbanized land trusts that own and manage community gardens, for example, and do all that, and everything in between. Because that local presence is really important. More often, there's already something in existence and we can work with them, but where it's not in existence, then we're not afraid at all to set something up to do that.
Jeff, I'd like to ask you a question. In our work, which at Marcel Day, which actually has some parallels with
absolutely
your work
right,
we are seeing clients come to us with more explicit requests around buffering against climate vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to know to what extent that's more of a driver in the conversations that communities bring to you than it was, say, 10 years ago.
That's a great question. 10 years ago, let's say that just as a specific example, I was doing conservation work in the state of Alabama. There's an island off the coast of Alabama called Dauphin Island, which is a very low-lying island. It's a fantastic place, and if you're a bird watcher, it's incredibly important. It's really important for the Mobile, Alabama economy. And there's a lot of interest in doing some kind of protection work on Dauphin Island. Yeah, even among the congressional delegation, it was always saying, look, we can bring federal money to the table here to protect this place. And even then, 10 years ago, we were saying, I don't know. I mean, it's really low-lying. And you may have noticed that every time there's a hurricane, not only is every house wiped off of Dauphin Island, and we use federal insurance to rebuild them, but you may have noticed in the last hurricane that the island was physically cut in half, and we're not sure that it's a good use of the taxpayers' money to do something on Dauphin Island. And that was sort of a radical statement for a conservation group to make. I contrast that today, where I would say 70% of our conversations with communities begins with the point you just made, which is, we've been thinking about this for a long time, but Katrina, Sandy, Irene, Ike, pick your storm, last year's blizzards, 2011's heat waves, whatever, have made us realize we need to do something really soon. And the interesting thing is the conversation always involves around the built and financial infrastructure. That's what people are really concerned about, is that billions of dollars of damage is occurring, and they're looking for the most efficient way to do that. So Mayor Bloomberg wants to build Amsterdam-style dikes around New York City, which is our seawall. It's just, when you start adding up the money to do that, it's just extraordinarily expensive. So then the question becomes: is that the most cost-effective way to build resilience in New York City? But that conversation happens big cities, small towns, everywhere.
Okay, that's great. So I think it's probably about time for us to wrap up. I do want to say that we've been filming this, so if anyone would like a link to that presentation that you'd like to share with others, please just send us a note. We're happy to share that with you. I do want to thank Jeff again for being here today. It's just awesome.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, everybody. This was terrific.